Throughout history, there's been a pattern most people never connect. While entire populations lost everything overnight when governments turned hostile, one group consistently managed to preserve their wealth across centuries of persecution. The difference wasn't luck. It was a sophisticated understanding of wealth protection that contradicts everything modern financial advisors teach you. What Jewish communities developed through necessity became the blueprint for surviving government confiscation, and the principles are more relevant now than ever. Let me show you something that will change how you think about protecting assets. When you look at medieval Europe, the Ottoman Empire, or even 20th century regimes, Jewish families didn't just survive wealth seizures. They often emerged with their capital intact, while neighbors who seemed more secure lost everything. This wasn't about having more resources. Most started with less. It was about understanding a fundamental truth that governments don't want you to know. Wealth isn't what you own. It's what you can move, hide, and reconstitute when systems collapse. The first principle they mastered was portability over property. While European landowners built their wealth in estates and physical holdings, Jewish communities learned the hard way that anything you cannot carry can be taken. This created a completely different approach to wealth. Instead of investing in land they could be expelled from, they built wealth in skills, networks, and portable assets. A diamond merchant could sew his entire fortune into his coat lining. A moneylender's real asset was his knowledge of who owed what to whom. Information that lived in his mind, not on paper that could be confiscated. This might sound like ancient history, but watch what happens when you apply this lens to modern wealth. Your house, your business location, your physical possessions are all vulnerable to the same forces. Governments can tax property, seize land, or make it worthless through regulation overnight. The families who understood portability invested differently. They taught their children trades that traveled, languages that opened doors in other countries, and skills that had value regardless of geography. Here's where it gets deeper. They developed what I call networked wealth, and this is something that completely changed the game. Instead of hoarding gold in a single location, wealth was distributed across family networks spanning multiple countries. A merchant in Amsterdam would have cousins in Venice, brothers in Cairo, and business partners in Constantinople. When one city became dangerous, the wealth had already been transferred through family networks before authorities even knew to look for it. Think about the mechanics of this for a second. A Jewish trader facing expulsion from Spain in 1492 didn't panic about moving physical gold across borders. Letters of credit, family obligations, and business debts owed to relatives in other cities meant his wealth was already distributed. By the time soldiers came to confiscate assets, they found modest homes and basic goods. The real wealth had transformed into obligations held by family members in safe territories. The system was genius because it used relationships that governments couldn't break and debts that couldn't be physically seized. Now contrast this with how most people build wealth today. Everything in one country, one currency, one property market, one banking system. The moment that system turns hostile through hyperinflation, capital controls, or outright seizure, they're trapped. They built their entire financial life in a structure that can be dismantled by a single government decision. The Jewish approach was the opposite. Diversification wasn't about different stocks in one market. It was about different countries, different systems, different currencies, all connected through family trust rather than legal contracts that governments could void. Write in the comments which city you're from, because understanding how geography affects your wealth protection options is critical to applying these principles in your specific situation. The second major strategy was investing in liquid, universally valuable assets. Gold and precious stones became preferred stores of value, not because they were pretty, but because they held worth across every border and every regime. A gold coin minted in France, spent in Poland. A diamond carried the same value whether you were in Christian Europe or the Muslim world. This wasn't superstition. It was pragmatic recognition that paper wealth, property deeds, and local currency could become worthless overnight when you crossed borders or when governments changed the rules. Look at what happened in Germany during the 1930s. Jewish families who held their wealth in German marks, German property, and German businesses found everything trapped. Currency controls prevented moving money out. Property sales required government approval that was denied. Business assets were Aryanized through legal mechanisms. But families who had maintained the old traditions, who kept a portion of wealth in gold, who had international business connections, who had transferred assets to relatives abroad years earlier, had options. The wealth that seemed backward and old-fashioned became the only wealth that could be preserved. Here's the principle underneath all of this. Governments can only confiscate what they can identify, locate, and legally claim. Physical property is easy to identify and legally claim. Bank accounts in local institutions are trivial to freeze. Businesses registered in their jurisdiction are simple to seize. But knowledge, skills, international relationships, and portable valuable assets create layers of protection. Each layer makes confiscation harder, and the combination makes it nearly impossible without the owner's cooperation. They also understood something about human psychology that was brilliant. Appearing wealthy made you a target. Appearing modest made you invisible. While Christian nobles displayed their riches in castles and landholdings that announced their wealth to everyone, Jewish families often lived simply on the surface. The real wealth was hidden, portable, and distributed. This wasn't about being secretive for its own sake. It was about survival. The moment you became an obvious target, you became vulnerable. Better to appear as a modest merchant than to paint a target on your back with visible displays of wealth. This created a cultural approach to money that valued security over status. Instead of the biggest house, they invested in their children's education. Instead of the finest carriage, they built relationships with trading partners in other cities. Instead of jewels worn in public, they held gems that could be hidden or carried. Every financial decision was filtered through a simple question. If we had to leave tomorrow, what could we take with us? That question shaped everything. Now think about how this applies today. Most people optimize for the opposite. They buy the biggest house they can afford, tying up capital in an immovable asset. They invest in local businesses dependent on one economy. They hold wealth in paper forms that require government cooperation to access. They display success in ways that make them obvious targets for taxation, lawsuits, or regulatory attention. They've built the exact opposite of a portable, protected wealth structure. The families who survived understood that true wealth security required thinking in generations, not quarters. A father might take a loss moving assets to safety, knowing his children would benefit. An entire family might live modestly for years while building international networks that would protect wealth for decades. They played a longer game because they understood the cycles of history. Periods of tolerance and prosperity would be followed by periods of persecution and confiscation. The families that prepared during good times survived the bad times. Here's something that most financial advisors will never tell you. Legal structures provide less protection than they claim. When governments decide to take wealth, they change the laws. Trusts, corporations, legal entities, all of these provide protection within a stable legal framework. But when the framework itself becomes hostile, legal protections evaporate. What protected wealth wasn't legal structures. It was the practical impossibility of finding, proving ownership, and physically taking assets that were already distributed, portable, and hidden. This is why they invested heavily in children's education regardless of cost. Knowledge cannot be confiscated. A son trained as a physician, a jeweler, or a scholar carried his wealth in his mind. He could practice his profession in any city that would accept him. Compare this to inheriting land that could be seized or a business that could be shut down. The investment in human capital was the ultimate portable wealth because it moved with the person and couldn't be taken by force. They also built redundancy into everything. Multiple citizenship options through family connections. Multiple languages so they could operate in different markets. Multiple skills so one trade could replace another. Multiple locations where family could provide support. This redundancy meant that when one option closed, others remained open. It was the opposite of putting all eggs in one basket, taken to an extreme level because the stakes were survival itself. The network effect of these strategies was powerful. A family that had been following these principles for generations had relatives in 10 countries, connections to traders across 3 continents, children educated in multiple professions, and wealth distributed in forms that could move quickly. When crisis came, they had options that newly wealthy families lacked. The newly rich might have more total wealth, but it was concentrated and vulnerable. The families with generational wealth protection had less total wealth, but it was distributed and resilient. Look at what this means for modern wealth protection. Holding citizenship in multiple countries creates options when one becomes hostile. Building skills that are valuable internationally means you can earn anywhere. Maintaining assets in different jurisdictions means no single government controls everything. Learning additional languages opens markets and opportunities. These aren't luxuries. They're necessities for anyone serious about protecting wealth across generations in an uncertain world. The cryptocurrency movement accidentally rediscovered some of these principles. Portable wealth that exists outside government control, that can cross borders instantly, that can be held in your memory through seed phrases. This appeals to people for the same reason gold appealed to Jewish merchants. It's wealth that doesn't require government permission to move or access. Whether crypto succeeds long-term or not, the principle it represents is ancient. Wealth that you can control independent of any single jurisdiction is wealth that's harder to confiscate. But here's where most people miss the point. It's not about any single strategy. It's about the mindset underneath all of them. The mindset that asks, what happens when the system turns against me? What happens when I need to leave quickly? What happens when the rules change overnight? Most financial planning assumes stability and cooperation from institutions. Jewish wealth protection assumed the opposite. It planned for the worst case and built resilience to survive it. This created different priorities. A family following these principles might pay more in taxes or fees to maintain multiple jurisdictions. They might accept lower returns to keep assets liquid and portable. They might invest more in education than in property. On paper, during stable times, this looks inefficient. But when instability comes, suddenly the insurance value of these choices becomes clear. The question isn't what maximizes returns during good times. It's what ensures survival during bad times. The families that mastered this thought in terms of preservation rather than growth. Growth is wonderful when systems are stable and fair, but preservation is what matters when systems become hostile. Better to preserve 80% of your wealth through a crisis than to optimize for maximum growth and lose everything when the system turns. This conservative approach to risk seemed cowardly to people who never faced existential threats, but it was actually the most sophisticated risk management possible. Here's what's uncomfortable to acknowledge. These strategies were developed because Jewish communities faced systematic persecution and wealth confiscation for centuries. They learned these lessons through painful experience. Most people living in stable democracies think this could never happen to them. But history shows that governments everywhere, when facing fiscal crisis or political pressure, turn to confiscating wealth from unpopular groups. It happened in America with Japanese internment and asset seizure. It happened across Europe repeatedly. It happened in Cuba, Venezuela, and countless other places in living memory. The question isn't whether you're likely to face this. The question is what the cost is of being prepared versus being unprepared. If you structure your wealth for portability and protection and never need it, you've paid some efficiency costs but still prospered. If you optimize only for returns and face even one serious crisis, you could lose everything. The asymmetry is obvious. The downside of preparation is modest. The downside of lack of preparation is catastrophic. Those who truly absorbed what we've covered here understand that wealth protection is about structure, not just amount. You can have $10 million in a single bank account in one country and be more vulnerable than someone with 1 million distributed across jurisdictions, asset types, and networks. The structure determines resilience. Put in the comments, wealth is structure, not size. That phrase captures the core insight that took generations to develop. You just received a framework that wealthy families paid for through centuries of hard experience. This isn't theory from a textbook. These are survival strategies proven under the worst conditions imaginable. The fact that this knowledge exists and can be applied to protect your wealth today is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of this puzzle, and hit like if you recognize the value of learning from history's harshest teachers. What I'm going to show you next takes this foundation and reveals how modern technology has created wealth protection possibilities that didn't exist even 20 years ago, combining ancient principles with tools that make them more powerful than ever. You're going to want to see this.